and technology will come to order. With that, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Making the EPA Great Again. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and the ranking member. Today we will examine how the Environmental Protection Agency evaluates and uses science in its regulatory decision-making process. Sound science should be at the core of the EPA's mission. Legitimate science should underlie all actions at the agency, from research to regulations, and be an integral part of justifying their actions. Unfortunately, over the last 8 years, the EPA has pursued a political agenda, not a scientific one. Time and again, we saw the EPA under the Obama administration propose regulations that would have no significant impact on the environment. For example, the so-called Clean Power Plan proposed by the EPA last June set impossible targets for carbon emissions. Yet even EPA data shows that this regulation would only eliminate a minuscule amount of global carbon emissions and would reduce sea level rise by only 1/100th of an inch. In fact, the EPA has proposed some of the most expensive and expansive and ineffective regulations in history. The rules proposed and finalized by the EPA placed heavy burdens on American families. Often, huge costs were shouldered by the taxpayer with little to show for it. And the EPA routinely relied on questionable science based on non-public information that could not be reproduced, a basic requirement of scientific method. Americans deserve to see the science for themselves. The EPA had nothing to hide. Why didn't it make the scientific data it used for its regulations publicly available? What was the EPA hiding? The committee conducted oversight of EPA's use of suspect science to justify its claims. Our hearings culminated in legislation that required the EPA to make its data publicly available. With the transition to a new administration, there is now an opportunity to right the ship at the EPA and steer the agency in the right direction. The EPA should be open and accountable to the American people and use legitimate science. Though ignored by the previous administration, the EPA does have internal processes to ensure this accountability. The internal review process at the EPA should be restored and strengthened. The Science Advisory Board provides critical feedback to the EPA on its proposals. But in recent years, SAB experts have become nothing more than rubber stamps who approve all of the EPA's regulations. The EPA routinely stacks the board with friendly scientists who receive millions of dollars in grants from the federal government. The conflict of interest here is clear. Fortunately, the EPA can once again become an agency that is credible and respected. Simple changes, such as eliminating conflicts of interest, adding balanced perspectives, and being more transparent, can go a long way to restoring the agency's credibility. In recent years, the EPA has sought to regulate every facet of Americans' way of life. Instead, we should invest in research and development and let technology lead the way. Far too often, the EPA has deliberately used its regulatory power to undercut American industries and advance a misguided political agenda that has minimal environmental benefit. The new administration has the opportunity to let technology and innovation protect our environment without government mandates that impose costly and unnecessary regulations on the American people. The EPA should focus on environmental policies that can be justified and are based on good science. Lastly, recent news stories report that another agency, NOAA, tried to deceive the American people by falsifying data to justify a partisan agenda. A senior scientist at NOAA has questioned the scientific integrity of a study written by Tom Carl while at NOAA that claimed that there was no stop in global warming from 1998 to 2013. This official has provided evidence that Carl, quote, had his thumb on the scale, end quote, throughout the entire process. The Carl study was published in Science, the journal overseen by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In light of this new information, AAAS Science should retract the Carl study. And the committee will continue our investigation of NOAA's refusal to provide the committee with responsive documents on this subject. It is clear that the committee's investigation was justified. Although NOAA, AAAS, and others attempted to block the committee's efforts, our goal remains to ensure that the scientific process funded by the American taxpayer is, in fact, open and honest. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank our witnesses for being here today. In particular, I'd like to thank our former colleague in the House, Dr. Rush Holt, a scientist, for being here to share his unique perspective. I would also like to welcome to the committee our new colleagues on both sides of the aisle. As I stated at the organizational meeting this morning, it is my hope that we will be able to find common ground together on important issues this Congress. With that said, I'm disappointed, but not really surprised. Our very first hearing this Congress will be focused on attacking the Environmental Protection Agency, as was so often the theme of our hearings the last Congress. I would also note that of the witnesses invited by the majority to testify today, we have lobbyists for the industry, a representative from industry trade group, and a consultant for the industry. That is not a panel likely to produce an objective examination of EPA's activities. The efforts by some to undermine how the EPA and other federal agencies use science threatens our economy, threatens public health, threatens the environment, threatens public confidence in our government. This is especially true when efforts rely on biased, incomplete, and misleading information. Alternative facts, if you will, is an attempt to advance a probably false narrative against EPA. Regulatory activity to protect public health and the environment should be supported by a robust analysis of the best available scientific evidence. That is what EPA does. Policies geared toward preemptively limiting scientific input into the process undermine EPA's ability to take justifiable actions to protect the American public. Questioning the credibility of the scientific process, casting doubt on the scientific research used by EPA, or selectively limiting what sources of scientific information EPA may consider, jeopardize the effectiveness of the only government agency specifically tasked to protect human health and environment. Simply put, limiting the science EPA uses only serves to limit the actions EPA may take to protect public health and the environment. I hope that my colleagues will listen today with critical ear and ask themselves whether they want to support policies that will harm future generations instead of empowering them, remove public health safeguards instead of strengthening them, and reverse progress made over the last 40 years instead of working to find a constructive path forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and I'll proceed to introduce our witnesses today. Our first witness is the Honorable Jeffrey Holmstead, a partner at Bracewell. Mr. Holmstead is one of the country's leading air quality lawyers and heads the Environmental Strategies Group at Bracewell. He previously served as the Assistant Administrator at the EPA for the Office of Air and Radiation. He also served on the White House staff as Associate Counsel to former President George H.W. Bush. Mr. Holmstead received his bachelor's degrees in economics and English from Brigham Young University and his law degree from Yale. Our second witness today is Dr. Kimberly White, Senior Director in the Chemical Products and Technology Division of the American Chemistry Council. For the past 5 years, Dr. White has served as a scientific advisor to industry for the development and execution of research to assess chemical hazards. She also has worked to identify emerging issues and trends in science policy and risk evaluation. Dr. White received her bachelor's and master's degrees in biology and a PhD in environmental toxicology from Texas Southern University. Our third witness is the Honorable Rush Holt, CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Holt has held positions as a teacher, scientist, administrator, and policymaker. From 1987 to 1998, he was Assistant Director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, a Department of Energy National Lab. Dr. Holt served for 16 years as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, representing New Jersey's 12th Congressional District. In Congress, he was a member of the Natural Resources Committee and the Education and the Workforce Committee. Dr. Holt received his master's degree and PhD in physics from New York University. Our final witness today is Dr. Richard Belzer, independent consultant and former economist at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. There, he was responsible for reviewing regulatory analyses prepared by the EPA, the Food and Drug Administration, various components of the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Energy, and the Interior. Dr. Belzer has been an independent consultant in regulatory policy, economics, and risk analysis. In addition, he is the president of Regulatory Checkbook and the managing editor of neutralsource.org. Dr. Belzer received his bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural economics from the University of California at Davis, and his master's and PhD in public policy from Harvard University. We welcome you all, appreciate your attendance today, and Mr. Holmstead will begin with your testimony.
Thank you very much. Good morning. As the chairman mentioned, I am a partner at the law firm of Bracewell LLP, but I do want to make it clear I am not appearing on behalf of any clients this morning. I am here to share my own views as a former EPA official and as someone in private practice who has spent more than 25 years working with EPA on a range of issues. I want to start by saying I do believe that EPA plays a vital role in protecting human health and the environment. But I also know that there are opportunities to improve the way the agency operates and makes decisions. This morning, I would like to talk briefly about 3 reforms that would improve the way science is evaluated and used by the agency. First, I would like to endorse this committee's efforts to ensure that scientific and technical information that is used to support regulatory decisions is publicly available in a manner that allows for independent analysis. This is where the Secret Science Reform Act can make important and meaningful reforms. The only legitimate concern that I have heard about this legislation is that in some cases, data that is used to support rulemaking might include medical or other personal information about specific individuals and should not be released because of privacy concerns. I think this is a red herring. Certainly no one believes such information should be made public, but I cannot imagine a case in which personal information about any particular individual would be needed to support types of regulatory actions taken by EPA. I do understand that documentation used in some studies does contain personal information, but names, addresses, and any other identifying information could and must be redacted before any such information is made public. EPA would certainly incur costs to review data and ensure that personal information is redacted before it is made public. When regulations impose billions of dollars on consumers and businesses, it is surely appropriate for the government to spend a tiny fraction of this amount to ensure that the scientific information used to support those regulations can be publicly available. Second, I believe it is important to reform the Science Advisory Board, which is generally known as the SAB, and other advisory groups that provide scientific and technical advice to EPA. Such groups are referred to as independent advisory committees, but the EPA administrator appoints the members of these groups based on recommendations from EPA staff. Not surprisingly, EPA staffers tend to recommend people who share their views about issues under consideration. There is no question that the members of the SAB and other advisory panels are well qualified, but there are other scientists and researchers who are equally well qualified, but who do not get appointed because they may be more skeptical about EPA's views on certain important issues. The SAB Reform Act would help to ensure that EPA decisions are influenced by experts from a variety of fields and backgrounds that are relevant to the issues under consideration. By focusing on disclosure rather than disqualification, the SAB Reform Act would allow for a wider range of viewpoints while ensuring that any possible conflicts, financial or otherwise, are publicly disclosed. Third, I would ask this committee to continue to look at the need to reform EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, which is generally known by the acronym of IRIS. The IRIS program evaluates specific chemicals to which the public may be exposed and then sets reference values that are used in a variety of EPA and state regulatory programs. Unfortunately, outside experts believe that the IRIS program often overstates the actual risk posed by these specific chemicals. EPA is inclined to be conservative in making both regulatory decisions and scientific conclusions. For example, if there are 5 well-conducted studies finding that a substance poses very little risk and one that finds higher risk, EPA will typically place much more weight on one rather than the 5. Some argue that this is appropriate and that EPA should always err on the side of being overly protective. But this is an issue for policymakers, not for scientists. When decisions are made based on overly conservative science, it can mislead the public and impose unnecessary regulatory burdens on society. As this committee considers how to improve the way that EPA deals with scientific and technical issues, I hope it will consider potential reforms to the IRIS program as well. I thank you for giving me the chance to testify this morning, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Holmstead. Dr. White.
Good morning, Chairman Smith and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Kimberly White, a scientist with the American Chemistry Council, and I appreciate this opportunity to testify regarding EPA's use of science in its regulatory decision-making process. The business of chemistry is a critical component for manufacturing safe, high-quality products. ACC member companies and the public rely on science to spur innovation, advance product stewardship, and improve the assessments of chemical risk. Similarly, they expect high-quality science and objective assessment processes to underpin regulatory decisions by the federal government. ACC has long maintained that EPA chemical assessments can and should reflect the most up-to-date and relevant science regarding potential impacts to human health and the environment from chemical exposures. Although EPA has made efforts to improve its scientific approach, the actual implementation has been slow and often lacking. This has been fundamentally due to lack of a consistent science-based framework for conducting chemical evaluations. In 2016, Congress passed the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, or the LCSA, which provides EPA a mandate for use of the best available science and a weight of evidence approach in conducting risk evaluations for both new and existing chemicals. Implementing these new provisions under the LCSA will require significant changes to EPA's scientific evaluation procedures. Unfortunately, as indicated in EPA's proposed framework rule for risk evaluation, EPA believes existing practices meet the standards of the LCSA. ACC does not support this belief and will continue fostering approaches to advance the technical quality and objectivity of scientific evaluations, particularly by promoting more transparency in both what science is being considered and how that information is interpreted. My oral testimony today focuses on 4 areas to improve science evaluations at EPA, and my written testimony provides additional detail and some specific examples. First, EPA should ensure that its chemical assessments address information needs of decision makers and are fit for purpose. This includes clearly defining the scope of the evaluation, the methods to be used, and the utility of the evaluation for regulatory decisions. EPA is currently interpreting the LCSA as requiring the agency to evaluate all uses of a chemical. However, the LCSA clearly indicates that EPA has discretion to select those conditions of use for its scope of the risk evaluation. A clear scoping step allows the agency to determine if a screening level assessment identifies risk sufficiently or if a more refined risk evaluation is needed. This approach also enables EPA to meet the stringent deadlines of the LCSA and focus resources on those conditions of use where unreasonable risk cannot be ruled out. Secondly, scientific evaluations must utilize transparent and consistent criteria for selecting the most relevant, high-quality science and evaluating the evidence to draw conclusions. It is critical that EPA rely on studies of the highest quality, not simply those studies that produce the lowest points of departure or the highest exposure estimates. Thirdly, EPA should employ a transparent weight of evidence framework that integrates evidence from human studies, animal research, and mechanistic data. The LCSA requires risk evaluations to integrate and assess available information on hazard and exposures for the conditions of use. The LCSA also requires EPA to make decisions using a weight of evidence approach. Lastly, EPA must implement an effective peer review process. Peer review should be independent and objective, allowing for robust engagement with stakeholders to provide thorough review. It should also include a quality assurance process that explicitly evaluates whether peer review recommendations and public comments were completely and adequately addressed. In conclusion, ensuring that up-to-date, high-quality science underlies EPA decision-making is critical to protecting human health and the environment. This can be achieved by consistent applications of processes throughout EPA to conduct risk evaluations using a weight of evidence process as required by the LCSA. Thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony, and I look forward to working with members of the committee to ensure that high-quality science is a foundation for the agency's decision-making.
Thank you, Dr. White and Dr. Holt.
Good morning, Chair Smith and Ranking Member Johnson and esteemed members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS. AAAS is the largest general science membership society, publisher of the science family of journals, and our mission is simple: advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. The hearing today, as I understand it, is general and not about specific bills. So I will talk in general about the use of good science as a basis for policy and regulation. I'm pleased to note from the title of today's hearing that the committee acknowledges that the EPA has been great. The success of EPA is really because the environmental regulations of past decades have been based, such as the Clean Air Act, have been based on science. And that sets this EPA apart from a number of other regulatory agencies. It has worked. I want to state from the outset that I don't want my presence here to be construed as advocating for a specific environmental legislation. I want to talk about science and the process by which science is conducted. It must be recognized as the most reliable pathway to knowledge and the best basis for making public policy and regulations. Science is not a political construct or a belief system. It provides testable, fundamental knowledge of the world and how things work. It's a set of principles dedicated to discovery and the use of evidence to continually test those discoveries. And although science gets a great deal of credit for advancing our understanding of the world, I think it is less understood for its foundational quality, humility in the face of evidence. And over time, when one's cherished beliefs and partisan ideologies and wishful thinking have turned out to be wanting, the scientific evidence is most likely to remain. We need more reverence for evidence in our policymaking. Without reverence for evidence, and by extension, evidence-based policymaking, our country's future is compromised. Science is not static. That's why the process of science can converge on reliable knowledge. Science does not deal in cut-and-dry facts, ever immutable. Sometimes we'll see the science push aside understanding for a better, more verifiable understanding. That's the job of scientists through the scientific process, not the job of politicians second-guessing the scientific process. However attractive any of us may find our own belief at any time, one's odds of success are better if one goes with the scientifically established thinking. Scientific progress depends on openness, transparency, the free flow of ideas and people. These are principles that have helped the United States attract and benefit from science talent, from the Apollo program and exploring the far reaches of the universe, to advancing biomedical research, curing disease, to harnessing science to build a thriving high-tech sector. The United States has been a leader in science, in education, and in innovation, innovation. And the principles are the same principles that have allowed EPA to base their regulations on science. Furthermore, scientists, whether industry, academia, or government, must have confidence that they can conduct their work in an atmosphere free of intimidation and undue influence. Policymakers should never dictate the conclusions of a scientific study, and they should base policy on a review of relevant research and the provisions of relevant studies. In other words, the integrity of the process must be upheld. During the Bush and Obama administrations, federal agencies worked to develop and implement scientific integrity and access to data policies. This bipartisan recognition of strengthening the scientific integrity in federal agencies lays a good foundation that should not be weakened. In other words, I'm here to say, don't try to reform the scientific process. It has served us well and will serve us well. I thank you again for the invitation to testify, and I look forward to working with you in this Congress.
Thank you, Dr. Holt and Dr. Belzer.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony is informed by 30-plus years of experience with environmental science and economics, and I'm not testifying on behalf of any past or present client. Most of my recent consulting work is involved in intellectual property, and I don't think that's related at all to EPA. In 1983, then Administrator Bill Holthouse wrote an article published in Science that, quote, risk assessment at EPA must be based only on scientific evidence and scientific consensus. Nothing will erode public confidence faster than suspicion that policy considerations have been allowed to influence the assessment of risk, unquote. But EPA risk assessments are chock full of policy considerations, so it should be no surprise that public confidence in EPA has eroded as Ruckelshaus predicted. You need not and should not take my word for it. In 2004, the EPA's science advisor published a report on the agency's risk assessment practices. The science advisor defended these practices as follows, quote, EPA seeks to adequately protect public health and environmental health by ensuring that risk is not likely to be underestimated, close quote. Now, the Ruckelshaus principle, when asked to measure a mouse, EPA is not supposed to give dimensions closer to that of an elephant because elephants are riskier, which they are. The EPA science advisor justifies mistaking mice for elephants because EPA is, quote, a health and environmental protective agency, unquote. That's a non sequitur. The Central Intelligence Agency is a national security agency. Would that justify exaggerating the risk that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction? No. It is just as improper for EPA to exaggerate the human health risks of contaminants in drinking water, chemicals in commerce, or pollutants in the atmosphere. When any agency exaggerates risk, it undermines responsible regulatory decision-making, and it does so three ways. First, it scares the public, which cannot discriminate between large and small risks if agencies exaggerate. Second, it undermines the accurate estimation of benefits from regulation. Exaggerated risk estimates lead to exaggerated benefit estimates. Third, it usurps the authority of the head of the agency, who is charged by Congress with making oftentimes hard choices. He can't do that with reliable information. And if he figures out he's being sandbagged by his own staff, decides to ignore what he's being told, he will be accused of ignoring science. In my written testimony, I explained why EPA's safety assessments are not scientific, and I use EPA's definition of the reference dose, a copy of which is distributed to you, but here's the definition. A reference dose is an estimate, uncertainty spanning perhaps an order of magnitude of a daily oral exposure to the human population, including sensitive subgroups, that is likely to be without an appreciable risk of a deleterious effect during a lifetime. Now, an order of magnitude we understand, that's a factor of 10. But what is perhaps an order of magnitude? Does it mean less than 10? More than 10, a lot more than 10. Could it be 10? Could it be 1,000? Could it be 10,000? We don't know. What is an appreciable risk of a deleterious effect? How bad must an effect be to qualify as deleterious? What is an appreciable risk of experiencing such a thing? Now, these are not scientific terms. These are policy terms. Whose personal opinions inform these choices? This is a definition only a lawyer could love, and quite possibly only a lawyer could justify. There's a great deal of interest in transparency, and I highlighted the reference dose definition because almost every issue of transparency arises downstream of obscure definitions like this. Even if every other transparency issue were solved, the most fundamental opacities in EPA risk and safety assessments would remain. Now, probably the most effective thing Congress can do to improve the quality of EPA science, any agency science, to require that they adhere to the principles and procedures set forth in OMB's information and quality guidelines. These guidelines have been out for 15 years, but there's very little to show for it because agencies do not comply. And they don't comply because no one has standing in full court to compel them to comply. I'm happy to look forward to any questions you might have and expand upon this at your leisure.
Thank you, Dr. Belzer. Before we get to questions, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from California, Jerry McNerney, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. He has been selected to serve on the Science Committee, and his official appointment is imminent. So, Jerry, we welcome you back.
Well, I thank the chairman. I've spent 2 terms on this committee, so it's a great thing to be back, and I look forward to our together.
Absolutely. Thank the gentleman from California for his comment. Let me recognize myself for questions, and Dr. White, I'll address my first question to you. And that is, why would the EPA hide data that they say justifies regulations from the American people, and why should that data be made public? Turn on your,
There we go. Transparency in the way that EPA evaluates science and what data it selects to underlie its decision-making is extremely important. So that information should be made available so that folks can actually go through and evaluate those scientific evaluations. One of the things that we do need to take in consideration as making that data publicly available is that there are adequate protections, confidential business information to ensure that we keep innovation and competitiveness available for the marketplace.
Okay, thank you, Dr. White. And Mr. Holmstead, does the EPA use a biased modeling system to calculate and determine the benefits from its proposed regulations? And if so, why can that not be justified?
Well, thank you for the question. I think, at least for the last few years, EPA has used methodologies that clearly overstate the benefits of their regulations. And I'm happy to submit something that would provide you a bit more detail, but let me just summarize very quickly. Okay. Virtually any air regulation that's been done over the last 8 years is based on the benefits of a single pollutant known as PM 2.5 or fine particles. And people are surprised when they understand this. EPA issues regulation for mercury. EPA issues a standard for ozone. EPA issues a standard for diesel emissions. And yet, when you look at the underlying evaluation, EPA's claim is all of these things are justified because in some fashion EPA predicts that will reduce levels of fine particles in the environment. There's a whole other program for regulating these chemicals. There's a way of evaluating them, and yet the benefits that EPA claims is completely inconsistent with the way they do it in the other program. So again, this is an issue that probably deserves more than a short answer, and I'd be happy to provide that to you. But there's no question that EPA has started to use cost-benefit analysis as a way to promote its regulations rather than a tool that can be used to inform good regulatory decisions.
Okay. Thank you for that response. And yes, we'll take details and we'll make them a part of the record as well. Dr. Belzer, let me ask you about cost-benefit analysis. And why should there be a cost-benefit analysis for all EPA regulations?
Mr. Chairman, when it comes to benefit cost analysis, that would be the appropriate term, by the way, benefit cost analysis. I finished 8 years as Secretary-Treasurer of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis, and so I am an avid defender and advocate of the practice. And the reason is fairly simple, that it is impossible for decision makers, whether in an agency or on Capitol Hill, to understand what the implications are of actions that are being taken without benefit cost analysis. It can't be done without that. Otherwise, it's based on emotion, it's based on politics, based on cronyism, it's based on other factors. But and also, I would say it can't be based on science, because science is the underpinning to the benefits assessment in a benefit cost analysis. So it should be done all the time, and it's also cost effective. It costs relatively little money to do a benefit cost analysis, and it can save an enormous amount of regulatory costs, and it can also dramatically improve the benefits of a regulation. I'm particularly fond of one that I managed when I was at OMB, which the Department of Agriculture was trying to ban a product, and they were going about it all in a way that made no sense scientifically and economically. With help, I was able to change the justification for it, and we were successfully able to ban this product because people were dying from it. Without analysis, that can't be done. It would have been litigated, and the Department of Agriculture would have lost.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Belzer. And Dr. Holt, my last question for you. The editor-in-chief of your publication, Science, recently said, quote, Dr. Bates raises some serious concerns. After the results of any appropriate investigations, we will consider our options, and those options, quote, could include retracting that paper, end quote. Dr. Bates is a well-respected scientist who has given one of NOAA's highest awards for developing standards for preserving climate data records. Are AAAS and Science committed to taking his allegations seriously and launching a thorough investigation?
I think you're referring to the Carl paper that appeared in Science a couple of years ago, and the blog that appeared over the weekend, this past weekend, by one former scientist, Mr. Bates, Dr. Bates from NOAA. Dr. Bates said in an article published today, the issue here is not an issue of tampering with data. He does not, then from it is written, he does not believe that they manipulated the data. All he is doing, quote, is calling out a former colleague for not properly following agency standards. This is not the making of a big scandal. This is an internal dispute between two factions within an agency.
Dr. Holt,
there's nothing in the paper, the Carl paper, that at our current analysis suggests retraction.
Well,
We
I
are
am-
always looking at our papers to see whether
understand.
there is anything
Dr. Holt, my
truly
time-
erroneous.
My time's up. I encourage you to talk to Dr. Bates because everything I have read that he has said about Carl reports suggests to me that NOAA cheated and got caught. They did falsify data to exaggerate global warming. The Carl study cannot be replicated because supposedly the computer crashed, maybe like the computer at the IRS and the EPA. And clearly he suggests that the Carl study violated scientific integrity rules. To me, all that adds up to an investigation and possibly retraction. I just simply ask you to look at it. It may be a lot more serious than you think. Thank you, Dr. Holt. That concludes my questions, and the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, is recognized for her.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And at the end of my statement, I'd like to submit to the record a statement related to this very discussion with Dr.
Okay,
Bates.
without objection.
We hear a lot, Dr. Holt, of artfully crafted positions from non-scientists invoking science and the scientific process to support positions. Unfortunately, this is the kind of tactic that can generate confusion and doubt about the actual state of scientific consensus. As a scientist and a former member of Congress, how should science inform policymaking? And how can we as policymakers be sure that an agency like EPA is making agency actions based on the best available science? And how should we view disagreements between scientists over a particular study? And is it dangerous to assume that any such disagreement undermines the overall findings of such a study?
Thank you, Representative Johnson. The approach is to ask whether the procedure, the process of science has been followed, not to second-guess the results or let one's dislike for an outcome lead one to challenge the outcome for unscientific reasons, or to challenge the process because sometimes results are either unclear or unpalatable. The process, as I was saying earlier, for developing regulations at EPA is based on legislation that holds the science to be paramount, and is, I think, the job of oversight to make sure that the processes of science are working, not to try to reform them or substitute other processes. So, for example, whether health studies that are used for regulations are based on something other than peer-reviewed scientific research, not whether different standards of releasing personal information should be used. It is whether the standards of the field are being observed. So, for example, the Harvard Health Study that was used for regulations on air contaminants had some data, personal information about deaths, about families that would not be made available on the internet openly. That's not to say that there's any conspiracy here of hiding data.
Thank you very much. Also, as a scientist and academic, you've had the opportunity to help shape the educations and careers of many young scientists and engineers who were interested in pursuing careers in STEM fields. What type of impact would undermining the integrity of the scientific process by casting doubt on the accuracy or type of data that the EPA collects have on future scientists in environmental and health professional fields, and what impacts would it have on scientists and engineers broadly?
I've certainly talked to scientists who find it uncomfortable and unattractive to work in fields where they feel they are constantly second-guessed by politicians. and not, in a sense, allowed to operate freely in their work. That has sometimes a chilling effect, but at least it generates a level of discomfort that I think probably drives some scientists to go into areas that are maybe less relevant to public policy. And that, of course, is a real loss. We need the best science applied to things that affect people's health and livelihood.
Thank you very much, Matan.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holmstead and Dr. White, last Congress, the House passed one of my bills, the Science Advisory Board Reform Act. I'd like to visit with both of you about the body and where it might be improved. I'm concerned that the body has become perhaps an echo chamber for the EPA. Would you both agree with that concern, and how else would you suggest that the EPA better utilize the Science Advisory Board?
Well, maybe I'll start.
Please.
So yes, the Science Advisory Board is one mechanism that the EPA has to conduct a peer review process. As I mentioned in my comments, the peer review needs to be independent and objective. That means making sure that peer review process has appropriate expertise, also the depth in the committee to evaluate the assessments at hand. There also needs to be clear balance in the reviews, the peer reviews of the people participating in that process. So you need to make sure that if there's conflict of interest on the panel, or if folks have actually made specific recommendations about a particular chemistry that they're evaluating on that panel, that also is balanced in the review. What we've often seen most recently in the peer reviews conducted by the SAB is that EPA plays a prominent role in that peer review process. So oftentimes the conversations that are happening in that peer review get stymied by EPA's input during the peer review process, so it's not as independent as it should be. Additionally, currently in the peer review process conducted under the SAB, there's not really an adequate opportunity for the peer review panel to address or respond to peer review and public comments. And so there will be a large set of public comments that will be submitted into the process for the peer review, and that information is often discounted or ignored. And there's really no volition by the peer review panel or indication by the EPA that the peer review needs to address those public comments in any way. And finally, when the peer review actually generates their report and makes recommendations into the EPA, there's not a volition that the agency has to abide by all of the recommendations that have been identified by that peer review. So there seems to lack a check and balance of the peer review makes strong recommendations for improving the scientific quality of a particular assessment, but that information doesn't really get incorporated wholeheartedly into the final assessment.
Mr. Holmstead.
Just a quick answer. I do think it's problematic that it's the EPA administrator, based on EPA staff recommendations, that make all these appointments. Because that's the way the process works. The folks appointed often have views that are consistent with views of the EPA staff. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there does need to be additional views involved when there are other serious scientific points of view that are not represented on the panel. So I think there does need to be a way to ensure there's a little more balance and that the science isn't so one-sided. I also want to just quickly raise a particular concern. One of the subsidiary bodies underneath the SAB is known as the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee, the CASAC. By statute, they are supposed to look at certain issues and advise the administrator on those issues, including the CASAC is supposed to advise the administrator on the adverse economic and energy effects of certain regulations. CASAC has refused to do that for many years. Finally, the CASAC chairman said, I understand we have that obligation. The problem is we don't have anybody on our committee who has expertise in that. And so I looked at the administrator to appoint someone. And a few days later, the administrator said she had no interest in appointing anybody to do that issue, even though that's supposed to be done by the statute. And so there needs to be a way to ensure that appointments are actually appropriate to look at the issues that Congress and others ask these committees to look at.
Clearly, Mr. Holmstead and Dr. White, the general public that depends on us to analyze the results of these studies, that depends on the EPA to formulate policies based on the input from these various groups. It doesn't necessarily matter so much to my constituency who is in charge and changes from administration to administration, but the quality of that input needs to be something that folks can be assured about back home. So clearly, you both describe a circumstance where work needs to be done, and I think the committee will work legislatively on that. And with that, Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lucas. Without objection, I'd like to make a part of the record the entire comments by Dr. John Bates that were posted on February 4th. The headline is Climate Scientist versus Climate Data, as well as an article by Timothy D. Clark called Science, Lies, and Videotaped Experiments. And now, and the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I'd like to also place in the record, Dr. Bates today said that there was no manipulation. I'd like to enter this article into the record, which contains his quote.
With objection. And the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holt, I want to thank you for your work here in Congress previously and your work at AAAS. As a scientist, although some people would, I'm a social scientist, so some people question that, but as a scientist, I understand the important role of science, and I think we all agree that science should be what guides us in making decisions where that is appropriate. Politics should not be what is trumping science. I wanted to give you an opportunity. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add about the controversy with Dr. Bates, because I think you, Chairman, had run out of time there. Is there anything you wanted to add to that? Or?
Thank you. Of course, I don't know the internal disagreement, and it quite clearly is largely an internal disagreement. Dr. Bates was not part of one research group that produced the data that became the basis for the Carl et al. Paper. He does not like the way the other group conducted their research. What's most important is not that there was internal disagreement within NOAA about how to handle this, but that a number of other studies, including one most recently in one of AAAS' other publications, Science Advances, have replicated the work, have come up with the same conclusions, so that it is not profitable, considering the progress of science, to dwell on this one internal dispute about how to handle data. Fine, if Inspector General at NOAA wants to look at that, that's fine. If there are indeed erroneous or deceptive procedures followed, in further answer to Chairman Smith, I know our journals will consider redaction, but there just doesn't seem to be anything like that now. There's nothing that suggests there are problems with that work, and most importantly, even Mr. Bates says this does not change the policy-relevant conclusions about climate change. So I think that's most important to get out there.
Thank you. And while Dr. Holt, while the EPA is generally thought of as a regulatory agency, we're talking about research here. We know that its research in science has led to a number of important findings, such as the link between air pollution and cardiovascular health, and also has led to research at EPA has led to innovation such as the development of low-cost sensors for nutrient pollution in our nation's waters. So it's important that we understand part of the agency's mission is not just regulate, but also do research as another way to help protect health. Are we not sacrificing potentially some of this important work by meddling in EPA's practices or cutting its budget, or as some in Congress have would like to do, is completely cutting out the EPA? What would we be losing in research? In research, even take it away right now from research on climate change, but other research and the developments have come out of that, out of the EPA.
I think it is very important to have a scientific basis for the regulation, for EPA to conduct research intramurally, to sponsor research outside of EPA, because take the National Science Foundation, for example. They do not, they do basic research that ultimately may affect toxicology studies and so forth, but they don't do toxicology studies. They don't do air pollution epidemiology studies. Those are things that EPA can best do both with internal scientists in an intramural program and through external sponsorship. And that would include, I would argue, social sciences. We at the SSS believe that empirically based answers to questions that can be verified are science. That includes social science as well as the earth sciences and physical sciences.
Thank you. I'll be back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having the political courage to actually look into something that obviously is going haywire in our country. I mean, there's obviously something wrong in the arena, the scientific arena in our country. We have people telling us global warming is causing the drought in California. Now it's global warming is causing the flooding in California. And whatever malady we have, we end up having people telling us that the amount of CO2 that's being put into the atmosphere is the ultimate culprit. And then we have all of these contradicting results. I mean, and for example, and that's what this is all about today, is whether or not there really was a pause in the actual increase in the temperature of the planet since 1998, I guess it was. And the fact is, since 1990, we have had large increases in CO2. So if there had been a leveling off or an actually decline in temperature in some areas, that would mean the CO2 theory is wrong. Okay, that's a basic scientific area that needs examination and truth associated with it. Because there's been so many things that have been told to us that seem contradictory, we have every reason to be skeptical that our scientific community is maintaining its integrity. And why wouldn't it? Why would there be some sort of loss of integrity among America's scientific areas? Eisenhower warned us of that years ago. Everybody always remembers Eisenhower warning us, and this was exactly correct, about the military-industrial complex. And I will tell you that I think his words of warning there are something we should look at today, because today it even threatens the well-being of our country. But he also warned us about how government contracts become virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity, and warned us the prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely regarded. And just as he warned us against the military-industrial complex, he warned us that the integrity of our scientific endeavors could be undermined by this very same type of government interaction with our science community. And I think that that you, Mr. Chairman, have been courageous in taking this on, because there are people and very powerful forces at work in this world today that have their own agenda and are trying to justify it based on manipulating science, basically manipulating the people who did or did not get the scientific contracts to do specific research projects over the last 20 years. And I would hope that we would have, that we'd actually call Mr. Bates in to testify. I hope that this is the beginning hearing to try to determine truth. What counts is truth. What counts is whether or not we have people whose scientific findings have actually been, influenced by whether or not they get a government contract for research. And there are stories of this. A number of scientists have come to me telling me that where before a certain time period, they were receiving government research contracts. Afterwards, after it became clear they didn't agree with the CO2 theory, no more contracts. Well, this is all about the integrity of of science in the United States of America. And I guess Dr. Holt, would you like to refute everything I just said?
In 9 seconds, Mr. Rohrabacher?
That's it.
Okay.
Gentlemen,
There has been no pause. It has been examined from many perspectives, and scientists are fiercely independent. They would resent horribly if they felt their work was being manipulated. It's not.
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from, I was looking for the gentleman from California, Mr. Barrow, who's not here. The gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses and our former colleague, Dr. Holt, for being with us here today. I want to follow up a little bit, Dr. Holt, with the scientific process. I think I hope and believe there is agreement on this committee that sound science is absolutely essential to good decision-making, whether it's by the EPA, any other administrative agency, or members of Congress. So I'd like to ask you a little bit. There's been a lot of criticism from opponents of EPA regulations that sometimes EPA gives more weight to some studies than to others. Now, some see that and have characterized that as showing bias or favoritism. Can you explain a little bit more within the scientific process whether that's appropriate and why that might be appropriate to give more weight to some studies than others?
Thank you, Representative Esty. Some studies are extensive, longitudinal, long-range, comprehensive studies. Others are more superficial. Which ones do you think would be more useful for making decisions about your children's health? It is true that sometimes short, brief studies uncover things, and then they should be explored. In my opening remarks, I was saying, if you want to be on the right side of any issue, you would do well to go with the evidence, the best understanding at the time of what it's going to be, not some fringe idea. Scientists are always poking around the periphery, trying to find new understanding. But we shouldn't think that that is the center of gravity. Take the climate change issue we're talking about this morning. This is an internal dispute about a detail of how you might measure land temperatures or water temperatures. It is not a departure from the general understanding of what's happening to temperatures in our globe. And so some studies are indeed more worthy of trust and a better basis for sound regulation than others.
I'm glad you raised some of that because I live in the state of Connecticut, and we have very high rates of asthma. We are downwind from many of the power plants that have caused real problems, and we see it in higher cardiopulmonary issues. We see it in asthma in children. There's a great deal of concern in my state that some of the longitudinal studies will not be allowed anymore under some of the proposals we're looking at in secret science. We have the American Thoracic Society has provided some of that information. Can you explain and flesh out a little bit more? You referenced the longitudinal studies, and I know in my state there's a great deal of concern because we've seen real health benefits from some of those changes that EPA has promulgated based on these kinds of studies. Can you flesh that out a little bit, what that would mean for those studies?
Thank you. You know, I guess you're referring more to the secret science acts of previous Congresses. Now, I don't know what the chairman or others will be proposing in this Congress, but in the past, the legislation, in the name of providing openness, has meant that certain kinds of studies could not be considered because some of the data in those studies, and I mentioned this Harvard study on atmospheric pollution, well, actually on community health, could not be used. It would also, for example, hinder fast response. For example, some of the data from the Freedom Industries spill on the Elk River in West Virginia recently, I mean, a couple of years ago, some of that data could not or was not publicly disclosable. And that hindered EPA in their response. Chairman Waxman at the time actually contacted the manufacturer of the chemical to find out what it was. But the Secret Science Secret Science Act probably would have prevented that fast action. Chemically induced birth defects. No family wants the newspapers or the web pages to be listing information about their kids' birth defects. But if you're going to study birth defects, you got to look at actual kids and study the epidemiology. The Secret Science Reform Act presumably would have prevented that kind of necessary research.
Thank you very much, and I see my time has expired.
If the gentlewoman will yield real quickly, I think Dr. Holt knows as well as anybody that there's such a thing as redactions, and if it's personal information, that information can be redacted. We'll go now to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. White and all of you, I think we're all concerned when agencies promulgate rules that they say are based on sound data, and when they're asked to share the data, they say, no, we're not going to tell you what the data is. You just have to accept our word for it. So, Dr. White, in your written testimony, you highlighted the peer review process as a critical tool for ensuring government policy is informed by sound science. I think we can all agree on the importance of objective peer reviews, which is why I'm alarmed by some of the reported problems with the current peer review process at EPA and other agencies. Can you briefly explain why a transparent peer review process is so important to ensuring the quality of scientific information?
Sure. Thank you very much, Congressman, for that question. So as I mentioned, peer review is a critical piece of the science evaluation process. Having a third-party group of scientific experts evaluate and look at EPA's assessments is very important to establishing trust from the public.
Right.
And making sure that you have the appropriate expertise, one, on that peer review panel, that the EPA actually heeds the advice that they get from those peer reviewers and incorporates that information into their final assessment is critical. I think what we've seen is that that has not always been the case for the peer review process, and we'd like to see that change.
Okay. Follow-up, given what you've just told us, should agencies strive to allow the public to incorporate information from peer reviews into their comments on a proposed rule?
So the agency definitely should take in consideration the public comments that it receives. One part of the peer review process is getting in public comments. Those comments come from scientific experts that have evaluated the available data and provided that information into the agency. Unfortunately, in some of the programs, while they get the information that has been provided by the public, they don't incorporate or respond to that information. Specifically, in EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, one of their processes in Step 5 is actually a disposition of the public comments. So actually writing down how they will respond or address peer review and public comments. Unfortunately, in the last 3 assessments that they put out, they have not responded to those public comments. And so, again, this is kind of a violation of their own processes that they have currently in place.
Well, Thank you very much, Dr. White. Dr. Holmstead, continuing on the same point, can you discuss how both the scientific and rulemaking process is injured when interested and qualified parties are unable to comment meaningfully on science supporting a proposed rule?
Well, thank you for your question and for calling me doctor. Unfortunately, I'm the only one on the panel here who is only a lawyer and with
All right, we
economic
don't need to
training.
waste time on that. Go ahead.
In both policy questions and science questions, I've certainly seen that thoughtful discussions from different points of view lead to better outcomes. And I just think I think both on the regulatory side and the science side, that EPA and the public would be better served if we actually had people who were well qualified, who have different perspectives and different points of view, if they can try to resolve some of these issues instead of stacking some of these groups with people who share EPA's view.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Holmstead. Before my time runs out, I'd just also like to thank the chairman for the opportunity to explore this issue. I know a lot of us have been concerned about this, and a lot of our citizens are threatened by a torrent of bureaucratic attacks that they don't understand, that affects their lives and their livelihoods every day. And, Mr. Chairman, I just, again, want to applaud you for taking this issue on.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. Since you have a little time left, let me suggest to Mr. Holmstead that he seize on the Juris Doctor and start something new and go with the doctor. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byers, recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of attention has been paid to the title of today's hearing, Making the EPA Great Again. Under President Obama, the EPA took aggressive action to tackle climate change, which most scientists agree is the major threat to the planet and to the human race. We will not help anyone by disputing climate science with stories from white nationalist websites like Breitbart.com or tabloids like the Daily Mail. Scott Pruitt, the president's nominee to head the EPA, has sued the agency 14 times over its effort to regulate the oil and gas industry and has not said whether he would recuse himself from ongoing cases against the EPA. This is not a recipe for greatness. The new administration has scrubbed the EPA's website. It's frozen its grants and contracts. It's placed what amounts to a gag order on EPA employees and requested names of employees who worked on climate change. A Trump transition official suggested cutting the agency's workforce by 2/3, and a bill introduced by a fellow Republican will eliminate the EPA altogether. Mr. Chairman, this is not greatness. Alarming environmental disasters, like revelations on the consequences of pesticides and cities covered in smog and rivers catching on fire spontaneously, drove a Republican president, President Richard Nixon, to create the Environmental Protection Agency. And since then, the EPA's legacy has been one of great achievement. Among its most important accomplishments, the EPA banned the pesticide DDT. It significantly reduced levels of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, the leading ingredients in acid rain. It mandated lead-free gasoline, it regulated toxic chemicals, and established a national commitment to protecting our air and our water. The EPA has achieved so much in recent years, often over the misguided objections of this committee and a Congress which has tried to make things worse. Mr. Chairman, members of the fellow Science Committee, please listen to the Science Committee. Climate change is real, and environmental problems can't be wished away or pretended away because they're going to affect us, our children, and future generations. This committee should be leading the charge to protect the planet and our environment for future generations, and instead it attacks the credibility of scientists, casts doubt on accepted science, and makes life difficult for the people trying to solve urgent crises. The Science Committee's contribution now is like that of the Emperor Nero fiddling while Rome burned down around him. This is irresponsible and dangerous. It is not leadership, and will not make the EPA or America great. In fact, I think we should retitle this hearing, that we keep the EPA great. Or maybe just save the EPA, or protect our water. So with that, Dr. Holt, let me actually pose a question. Dr. Belzer said, and I quote from his written testimony, the EPA will strive for the highest estimate of risk that does not bring upon the agency unbearable ridicule. How would you respond to Dr. Belzer's comment that they always take the most extreme version of risk in their calculations?
I'm not a historical scholar of EPA, but I can say that in the history that you touched on, because this legislation from past decades was based on science, it has managed to keep up with growing knowledge and improved understanding of human health and the effects on human health and on the environment of various kinds of water and atmospheric contaminants. And the record is very good. So, I'm not a, Mr. Belzer is, he says, a scholar of benefit cost analysis. He wants it phrased that way, I think. I would not say that I am, but I do look at the results, and the results have been good.
Thank you. Dearest Dr. Holmstead, in your testimony, you wrote that, referring to the Science Advisory Board Act that we took up in the last Congress, that by focusing on disclosure rather than disqualification, that we would ensure that any potential conflicts, financial or otherwise, are publicly disclosed. But one of the objections we had to the act last time was that it in fact didn't do full financial disclosure. Are you aware that what will be intended this year will actually prompt full financial disclosure for people that would be appointed to that board?
I don't know anything about the bill that may be introduced this year, but I do believe that full disclosure, not only of financial conflicts, but other financial interests is an important part of the process. So again, I'm not familiar with legislation that may be forthcoming from this committee, but I do think that's an important thing.
I hope you won't mind us using your testimony when the bill comes before us later. So. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byron. By the way, my cap is going to read, "Keep the EPA honest." But appreciate the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my friend there from Virginia, I want to say I'm not going to quote any of those websites that you did. I'll choose an article by the Hill, not necessarily known as a right-wing newspaper, "Drowning by EPA Overreach," June 17th, 15, by Will Coggin. EPA recently found itself in hot water. The New York Times revealed the agency colluded with environmentalist groups in a campaign to manufacture public comments in favor of a new rule that expands its own power. The agency's actions and the shenanigans of its environmentalist supporters shed light on how a bad rule can flow through a regulatory process, not exactly your right-wing publication. But it does point to the fact why there's questions and why, with legitimate oversight, notwithstanding my friend's comments about this committee was wasting its time, why we have a legitimate oversight role to play, and we should be, and that doesn't make us a useless committee. And I applaud the chairman on his efforts to make sure that we hold the EPA accountable. Mr. Holmstead, how did he term you, my dearest Holmstead? Was that what he said?
Many people refer to me that way.
I've got that. I'm glad to hear you all have an intimacy there that few do. The EPA will often bury. Oh, let me do this. Adam Peshek from another publication said some time back in 2011. Actually, he said in an article from, 2 examples of EPA overreach, that measures taken to protect the environment are necessary and welcomed, but concerns for air quality should always be measured against the larger context of the economy and real-world achievability. So I think the fact that we're here and having this discussion gives us pause for concern that we ought to be able to have these discussions and question the science. The EPA will often bury the cost of its regulations while inflating benefits, measure against what Adam Peshek said, against real-world achievability. Do you think, Mr. Holmstead, it would improve regulations if EPA were more transparent in its cost-benefit analysis?
I do believe that the transparent cost-benefit analysis is important. I also believe it's important that the agency fairly present the results, because in some cases, if you dig into the details, you'll find that EPA has been relatively transparent. But the way they present their conclusions gives you a very different picture than.
You can understand why when articles come out from the New York Times that they've colluded with environmentalist groups to further their own power-making authority, their own rule-making authority, that, you know, the chairman of the Science Committee might have cause for concern and say, we might ought to have some oversight of that. You can understand.
Oh, no, absolutely, and I do think that was inappropriate. I was surprised to hear about that comment.
Thank you. Let me move on to the next. Over the past 8 years, based on what we just talked about, EPA has skewed its regulatory cost-benefit analysis to accomplish policy goals. Do you could you understand? Do you think this undermines public confidence in their analysis, and could you understand why?
I think that the short answer is absolutely. It would be better for everyone, for the public, for all of us in this room, if there could be more confidence in some of the conclusions that we get from EPA and other regulatory agencies. And that's why I think some of the reforms that you're talking about are very important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to go on to Dr. White. Dr. White, I'm concerned that the EPA has stacked its Science Advisory Board and Clean Air Science Advisory Committee with supporters, those that we talked about, the New York Times articles that they colluded with environmentalists, for example. The EPA rolls out a regulation and says that it's supported by its scientists, but no one is there to offer an opposing view. No one. So do you think there should be more balance on these advisory committees, in your opinion, Dr. White?
Absolutely. Balance is one of the keys that's important for having a peer review. You want to make sure that you have enough folks on the peer review committee and that there's appropriate balance so that you have discussion about what EPA has done. If you only have one side of the story being told at the meeting, or you only have one set of views on the peer review panel, then you're not getting the full picture and you're not really having a robust peer review.
So to you as a scientist, what does that say to you about those scientists, that they really believe in an open and fair process, or that they're pretty much consigned to just those who support their already predetermined analyses, for example?
I think what it shows is that there's just not appropriate balance on the committee.
Yeah.
And so you really have to make sure that if you build a committee that only has one set of views, then
Right.
you're likely going to get a certain answer.
You need a devil's advocate. Right. Yeah. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. The gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Rosen, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank everybody here today for their thoughtful testimony on what is clearly very controversial. And all slogans aside, we need to listen to the scientists who create a hypothesis, go through scientific method, come up with a conclusion. No matter who we have on the panel, there really is a process there, and that's what we need to pay attention to. So my question is for Dr. Holt. Although we would never want to replicate, or should we replicate, natural disasters or man-made disasters like the Gulf oil spill, an earthquake, what have you, I want you to talk a little bit about how excluding one-time events, things that can't be repeated nor should be, will impact the EPA, and we won't get the maximum scientific return if we don't study them.
Thank you, Representative Rosen, and I'm pleased you've chosen to serve on this committee. It's not just one-time events in the cases of emergencies, for example, disasters. Many studies cannot be repeated in exactly the same way. Right. The populations have changed. Those people have grown up or moved away, or the forest that you're studying has been overtaken by an invasive. Whatever it is, you sometimes cannot repeat it the same way. And the Secret Science Act is based, as it has previously been introduced, has been based on a misunderstanding of how science works. The gold standard is to find other approaches to come up with the same conclusions. Rarely can you repeat an experiment in exactly the same way. And so this cry that you have exact data that somebody else will take and and put it through their computer instead of your computer, yes, sometimes that makes sense. But what makes much more sense is that you approach the problem with a new perspective. And so that's not where this secret science legislation is heading. It's a misunderstanding of what it means to replicate experiments. I think that, well, anyway, you've said it.
Well, thank you. So I guess you would say then that the goal of science is to take these studies, collaborate, innovate, and inspire the next scientist to take the foundation of what you have put there to look at new hypotheses, a new way to find solutions or analysis of a situation.
Science doesn't make progress by doing the same thing over and over again. Science makes progress by looking at problems from new perspectives and testing it this way and that way and the other way, and ultimately converge on an understanding that is more reliable than you have from one experiment. That's how science works. It also means, of course, that the conclusions might have to be refined. I know it bothers some members of this committee that sometimes they hear that the different standards might be set. Well, yes, as the science progresses, you may change.
Where the data takes you.
And you should change,
yes,
but not on the basis of political whim or personal preference.
Thank you. Appreciate that, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Rosen. And the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you addressing this issue. I thank each member of the panel for being here today. I would like to just shift discussion briefly to an issue that's, I think, we haven't heard much about today, and that's the waters of the U.S. or the WATUS rule. The EPA has consistently claimed that the WATUS rule would not significantly expand its jurisdiction, but I look upon that claim with some skepticism because of what I'm hearing from my constituents in Arizona. And so I'm asking Mr. Holmstead right now, do you agree with EPA that the waters of the U.S. rule is not a significant expansion of their jurisdiction over waters, and in the case of Arizona, dry wash beds?
No, I think it's pretty clear that the WATUS rule does significantly expand EPA's jurisdiction. What part of their claim is that they've cast a broad net, and then you can come in and somehow be excluded, but that process takes a lot of time and effort. But the jurisdiction that EPA claims is certainly much broader than we've seen before.
Well, it seems to speak to an idea of that perhaps there can be an institutional bias, and I would categorize it as something in line with something like institutional maintenance. And in this instance, it's to regulate, to expand jurisdiction. And I think you've just indicated that you agree with that, perhaps, maybe not that there's a bias, but certainly the rule is. Do you see a bias there?
I think institutionally, EPA, and this is not just EPA, I think this is regulatory agencies at federal and local and state levels, but there is a tendency for them to want to increase their regulatory power, basically because they want to have an opportunity to impose their own will on many of these choices. So I think there's no question that we've seen EPA expand its regulatory power, or at least try to expand its regulatory power over the years.
Many manufacturers have indicated they're going to be impacted by this particular rule, the waters of the U.S. rule. Can you explain what areas of manufacturing that might be impacted by this, and any other anticipated results that we might see of waters being applied to them?
You know, most of the concerns that I've heard have been with regard to not existing manufacturing plants, but people who want to build anything that's new, whether that's a transmission line or a pipeline or a new facility. If it turns out you want to locate whatever you're building in an area that's included within this broad definition, it becomes much, much more difficult to do that.
And so I guess, Mr. Holmstead, to be more direct, we're talking really about permitting issues really become a major problem with this expansive rule.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The fact that you need government approvals and in some cases, many different approvals from many different agencies, I think is a shame. It's become very hard to build new things in this country, and I think that kind of permitting reform, not only reforming the WOTUS rule, but other permitting programs, to get them to function more efficiently would be a huge step in the right direction.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. And the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back, Dr. Holt. It's nice to see you again. We certainly miss you on the committee, but I very much appreciate the work you do with the AAAS. And before I ask my question, I want to make sure that all of our colleagues know about the event that the AAAS helps to organize each year, the Golden Goose Awards. This is an award that is earned by groups of federal, hardworking researchers whose seemingly obscure federally funded research has led to major breakthroughs in national security, public health, computing, energy, and the environment. So it's a great annual bipartisan event, and I hope all of our colleagues join us to support scientists and federally funded research. I want to align myself with the remarks by my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Beyer. Dr. Holt, as you know, our planet is facing the real consequence of anthropogenic climate change, and I'm deeply disappointed that we're not beginning this session focusing on how the EPA can address that critical issue as part of its mission to protect human health and the environment. In my home state of Oregon, the renewable energy industry has created thousands of jobs and is growing. And I wanted you to follow up on, I know Representative Esty asked you about the human health effects. Can you also talk about the economic benefits of addressing climate change?
I know that there have been many criticisms over the years of the cost of environmental regulation and the cost of addressing climate change as one of the biggest environmental challenges. And most of that debate pays insufficient attention to the cost of not addressing it, the costs in lives and dollars. And that goes for climate change as well as regulations restricting pollutants and other environmental hazards. There's an extensive literature on it. It's difficult, of course, to calculate because some of the benefits and some of the costs are second and even third order and indirect. But it's pretty clear, I would say, that a cleaner environment, such as we have obtained through environmental regulation implemented by the EPA, that a cleaner environment is economically better, in addition to being better for human health. And for climate, it remains to be seen how hard we're going to work to bring climate change under control, and how expensive it will be if we don't do a good job.
Thank you. And I wanted to...
And the benefits from the industries in trying to do a good job.
Thank you. And I wanted to follow up on a discussion that was already brought up today about the piece of legislation that has been introduced that proposes abolishing the Environmental Protection Agency and basically going back to the days when states would regulate clean air and water. So I know that under the Obama administration, there were partnerships between states and the EPA. This is something that's going to take federal and international solutions. Can you talk a little bit about what would happen going back to the days when there was no EPA if we let states regulate clean air and clean water?
Well, Representative Byers touched on this. Rivers caught fire, people lived in levels of smog that we only see in China these days. Well, actually, they're probably seeing it a little bit worse even. But and so my response to that is the regulations, by and large, have worked, and that's what we should be looking at.
And Dr. Holt, also in the 114th Congress, the House considered legislative proposals that would have applied the research restrictions that are on the EPA from this so-called Secret Science Reform Act to research efforts at all agencies. If such a proposal were to become law, what would the effect be on the research mission, not only of the EPA, but our other federal agencies as well? And this committee has jurisdiction over the NSF, for example.
Well, there isn't an agency in the government that doesn't have significant science components. We at AAAS wrote to every one of President Trump's nominees for a cabinet position, and I said in the letter, I hope you realize that you are heading up a science agency. The Attorney General, yes, he would benefit by having a better understanding of forensic science. The housing and urban development. Yes, there is social science and other science that is done by the department, but also science that must be used by the department if they're going to make good decisions. The point is, science-based policymaking is important in every aspect of our government. And if the scientific process, the free communication, the free collaboration, the ability to operate without intimidation, is compromised anywhere, it will hurt our government's functioning, it will harm the economy and human welfare.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. And the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of the four of you for being here today to educate us and discuss ways that we can look at reevaluating the role of the EPA in 2017 and beyond. Growing up in, fighting for, and subsequently representing Northeast Indiana before coming to Congress in the Indiana State House has made me aware of the many ways in which the EPA's policies impact hardworking constituents in my district, with citizens from every walk of life, from farmers to small business owners, workers, and even family members. I've heard from many of these constituents over the years raising concerns directed at the broad, burdensome, and relatively clandestine authority exercised by the EPA. So therefore, I've been a firm believer that our government, where authorized, should implement environmental policies based on sound science that focus on innovation rather than regulation. Sound science is the foundation of sound regulatory decision-making. So with that, I'm fortunate to have an opportunity on this committee, and I thank the chairman for giving me the opportunity on this committee to be a part of investigating and reforming the EPA's regulatory power. And with that, I'll direct my first question to Mr. Holmstead. In your written testimony, you highlighted the importance of both scientific accuracy and transparency in the EPA's decision-making process. On that note, should the risk assessment process and the cost-benefit analysis process of the EPA be examined and reformed to make it more scientifically based and objective? And with that, what should Congress's role be in reforming that process?
I'll give you a short answer, and you might want to ask Mr. Belzer, who really has had much more experience in risk assessment. I think it is appropriate for Congress to step in and to institute some reforms that could improve the process. And I want to be clear, I think EPA does a lot of very important good things. But I also know from my own personal experience that there's some things that really do need to be reformed. We do enjoy a cleaner environment in large part because of EPA, but in some ways we pay up a lot more than we should for the protection that we get. There are better ways to do these things, and I think that's one of the things that this committee is looking at is, are there better ways for EPA to do its job?
Okay, thank you. And Dr. White, there used to be a time where EPA's Science Advisory Board and Clean Air Science Advisory Committee would issue reports with dissenting views. Now it seems like those bodies just come together in a general consensus that almost always aligns with environmental or conservation groups. Do you think the EPA's scientific advisory boards could do a better job at encouraging a broader or more transparent range of views?
Absolutely. The process needs to be balanced. I mentioned that earlier in my testimony today, that if you have balance on the committee, you're going to get dissenting views, and that information needs to be captured and considered by the agency. That's really the value of having an open and independent peer review process, is so that you get a really robust review of EPA's evaluation of the science and what it's going to use to make those decisions before they are finalized.
Okay, thank you. And back to you, Mr. Holmstead. Do you think it would help if the EPA presented its regulatory impact analysis in a more concise or easier to read format?
You know, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, because sometimes when you make things too simple, you don't do justice to the complexities involved. So I agree that there's room for improvement. But again, you want to be sure that this documentation gives people enough information so that they understand that things aren't always quite as black and white as the agency would make them appear.
And then one final question for you that you might or might not agree with. The EPA has historically, in my opinion, had a shoot-first style of regulating. The agency issues a regulation before it is fully thought through whether it can be accomplished. How does this unnecessarily create burdens for businesses and manufacturers, or would you agree that it does?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think I've long been critical of one part of the Clean Air Act that imposes a legal requirement on states and local governments that in many cases is impossible to meet. It's just not achievable. And that has all kinds of implications for businesses that want to locate there. And I just don't think it makes any sense to give an agency authority to mandate things without considering whether they're achievable.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized.
Well, thank the chairman. Thank the chairman for holding this hearing. It seems to me that the issues of contention today would be how science is conducted, meaning does it follow standards? Does it follow standards that science usually follows? Is it peer reviewed? And is it influenced by politics or not? And on the other hand, how the science is used in rule making. So my first question will go to Mr. Holt. Would the Secret Science Reform Act ensure that science follows science standards that's used at the EPA?
No, I think the problem is it's an attempt to substitute a different view of what is meant by openness and a different view of what is meant by sharing than is the standard in the practice of science. And my earlier plea today was that, and I'm not saying, oh, trust the scientists, I'm saying trust the process.
Right.
And don't try to rework the process because you think you'll get better results, because you won't. And with regard to the Science Advisory Committee, I mean, that is a science advisory board. It will not function better by having fewer scientists on it. It is supposed to look at science, but in the name of balance and diversity, there's an effort to make it, well, less scientific. And that's, it seems to me, not the way to go. That's not what the SAB is for. There might be other places in the department where you want to bring in industry representatives to talk about the cost of the regulations to the industry. But I don't think the Science Advisory Board is the place to do that.
Well, would the Secret Science Reform Act lessen the influence of politics in the scientific process?
No, I mean, I think it's fundamentally substituting a politically originated revision of the process for the scientific process that has grown up over the ages.
Thank you. The second part, is how science is used in rulemaking. My first question goes to you, Mr. Belzer. What are the standards used in the cost-benefit analysis? And I know you don't like cost-benefit. I don't need like benefit cost, but I'll use it anyway. What are the standards used for human health and human life in cost-benefit analyses?
We have 30 to 40 years of experience doing that. This is within the field of benefit cost analysis. There isn't any controversy, regardless of one's political orientation, as to whether that ought to be done. There are technical arguments about how to do it, but there isn't any dispute in the field about whether it ought to be done and the effort ought to be put into doing it. It's, again, if you think of economics as a scientific field, and I should point out that a lot of physicists feel the same way, they become economists.
Right, but what I'm asking is, what are those standards? How do you include human life and human health in cost-benefit analysis? How do you do
The
it?
standard mechanism for dealing, let's say, with premature mortality, which is the largest component of benefits from most environmental regulations, is to estimate the number of premature lives that are lost, and there's premature death, and then there's an extensive economics literature on valuing the premature death, and so that goes into the benefits assessment. And I should point out, EPA is very fond of this. EPA uses this all the time. This is not a matter of controversy among economists. EPA has used this same literature to estimate the benefits of the Clean Air Act, and they've done so repeatedly. So the controversies with that have to do with things that are at a more technical level, not at a principled level.
So what is the cost or benefit of premature death?
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, how much does it cost? What does a premature death cost?
What does it cost to?
Right. In your analysis.
I'm sorry. I'm mostly deaf, so I need clarity in.
So you say it's just a technical matter. Well,
Yes.
then what is the cost of a human life in your cost-benefit analysis?
What value? Agencies differ in the values that they use. I believe that EPA's figure is on the order of $9 or $10 million per premature life, essentially the value of saving or preventing a premature death. I think the Department of Transportation uses a number that's quite a bit lower than that. OMB provides guidance on how to do it, but doesn't tell them what to do. And the circumstances may well vary. So there isn't a fixed value. There are underlying procedures about how to estimate for a given situation, and those procedures are pretty much the same across agencies. But agencies do differ.
So there's leeway then?
There's leeway, but it's not leeway in terms of the methods. It's leeway in terms of where the data and analysis lead you. This is the same principle Dr. Holt was talking about. Economics is a science, in my view, and so we apply scientific tools, scientific method to developing these estimates. There are things that are hard to estimate.
In letting me run over, so I'm going to yield back at this point.
Thank you, Mr. McNary. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holt, I just want to, and Dr. White, I have very high regard for your professions. I just want to ask you, are you saying that, for instance, the scientists who work on the on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for those whose work has been in regard to climate change, should be held in high regard, subject same peer review of everybody else, but given respect? Is that Dr. White?
Yes.
Okay, how about you, Dr. Holt?
Yes, I think so. I'm not quite sure I understood your question, but.
Well, I'm just asking
But
if
the scientists who
people
work
are-
on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that I know personally, I highly respect, and when I look at the work that has come out of that, I would say that's good science.
And would you say that's true of the other scientists that work on that? I mean, they have to be held in pretty high regard to be added to that panel.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to introduce this for the record, Mr. Chairman, that there's a number of scientists who worked on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change who now fiercely dispute what the panel has produced in terms of their projections on climate change. In fact, one of them says, warming fears are the worst scientific scandal in history. When people come to know the truth, what the truth is, they will feel deceived by science and scientists. So if I may, I'd like to submit that for the record. Dr. Belzer, there's been a lot said here about asthma and health as a risk of, as a result of human activity. I just want to share some things with you. From 1980 to 2012, our gross domestic product increased 467%. Vehicle miles traveled went up 94%. Populations increased 38%. Energy consumption's up 22%. Emissions, however, are down 50%. But the interesting thing is that, and these are EPA stats, these are U.S. government stats, is that even though our air quality and water quality are demonstrably better, but particularly air quality in regard to asthma, than they were in the 60s and 70s and 80s, asthma rates have exploded. Can you give any explanation for that?
I am familiar with some of that literature, and I suspect, but don't know, that one of the things that's changed is the definition of asthma has expanded. And if you increase make the definition broader, you're going to have more people in it. So that certainly could be part of it. But I do agree that this is a conundrum that with declining air pollution, that you would have increasing asthma is certainly contrary to the expectation and belief of many people who think or believe that asthma is caused by air pollution. So this is a problem. This is one that good science ought to be put to it, and we ought not to impart upon it a policy judgment first as to what the answer is.
Okay, here's what I want to point out. First of all, I'm not a climate denier, as some claim. I think that it is caused by natural variations. I think there's enough science out there that indicates that that's a viable position to have. But also in regard to what's been said in this committee, that it's clear, I think, from particularly what some of my colleagues on the other side have said, that they want to link asthma to human activity, pollution. And in every respect, I mean, lead, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, volatile organic chemicals, nitrogen dioxide, PM10, PM2.5, everything is down. Yet they want to make it about that. And I think that's a misrepresentation of science, the very thing that we're trying to avoid here. And I also have an article, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record from Scientific America. To your point, Dr. Belzer, we don't know what causes asthma. It could, I mean, there's everything, hypothesis from hygiene to obesity to sedentary lifestyles to to poor housing quality for lower income families. So I really do think where we're trying to go with this committee, to be able to validate the science, to get the politics out of it, is the place we need to be. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, and the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Danahosa, are authorized to participate in today's hearing. They've been selected to serve on the Science Committee, but have not officially yet been appointed. Seeing no objection, the chair now recognizes Mr. Foster for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if it's my understanding that just as we speak, I think I'm likely to be officially appointed to the committee. But
hooray!
It's yeah. So, Dr. Holt, you know something about Science Magazine, and there was an interesting article a couple of weeks ago entitled "The Polluted Brain," which had a very interesting discussion of the growing evidence for the link between particulates that are about an order of magnitude too small to be detected by normal air quality monitoring equipment, and dementia and Alzheimer's. and had some actually rather alarming numbers in it. And as well as an honest discussion of the scientific uncertainty in this. And the potential economic impacts of this are huge. About roughly 1/3 of all of our Medicare spending is projected to be due to Alzheimer's within a couple of decades. You know, if Alzheimer's did not exist, there would not be long-term financial stress on Medicare. And so this is it's a huge issue to the extent that it is attributable to this. And there's also difficulty that is traditionally not, these are things, instead of 2.5 microns and above, these are 200 nanometers and below. And so that there is a significant belief that they penetrate through the blood-brain barrier and actually do damage to the brain. It's well documented that they cause things like asthma, cancer, and recently heart disease. But now the fact that they could be responsible for a significant amount of that is, I think, a source of growing concern and potentially a subject that this committee will be discussing a lot and the EPA should be raising. And so, so I raise it because it's sort of a prototypical example of how science is a moving target in environmental regulation. And it strikes me that there are two dangers that we have, one of which is that as soon as this danger begins to have some scientific plausibility associated with it, large commercial interests will try to suppress that science. I mean, we saw that in cigarettes and a number of other areas. And so I was wondering if any of you could comment on the best way to prevent that from happening, because there will be a large number of manufacturing products, consumer products, and so on that will be responsible for exposing people to these very small particulates, and this may cause changes in the business model. And so I was wondering if you, just any of you, have comments on how to make sure that that does not happen in a way that happened with cigarettes. Or can't it happen anymore?
Well, Representative Esty asked earlier, why are some studies more credible than others? One can certainly discount studies that seem to be driven by special interests. It's not enough to just disclose where your funding comes from, but that at a minimum should be done. But then, as you know, in the tobacco case and in so many other cases, it's depended on finding forensic evidence, internal communications of collusion. That was certainly true when Henry Waxman exposed the collusion in the tobacco industry. There's no easy way that I know of to do that.
And Dr. Belzer, to sort of follow up on Representative McNerney's question about, there's a number, I think you cited $10 million per human life or some number like that. How do you value a 1 year of suffering from Alzheimer's? Is there a number associated with that when we do the cost benefit, or is it only deaths that we typically consider?
It is certainly true that most of the research effort has gone into estimating benefits from mortality. The logical one is that mortality is the worst health effect that one normally can imagine. I am hesitant to agree with that because Alzheimer's is one of those things that might well be worse for a lot of people. My mother endured almost 20 years of it before her death in 2012, and but figuring out how to estimate it, it requires some resources to be devoted to it. I don't think that there are any economists who would shy away from the effort. They would find it extremely interesting and challenging and would put forth the best possible objective effort to do so in collaboration with the neurobiologists who would be best equipped to help us.
Would that effort to get to the real scientific and economic analysis be easier or harder if the size of the EPA staff was cut by a factor of 3?
I'm not sure that it has any correlation at all with the size of the EPA staff.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Risk assessment guidelines will enable the EPA to achieve consistency in the conduct of chemical risk assessments and will help avoid manipulation of evidence and assumptions to achieve predetermined results. It's my understanding that existing risk assessments guidelines are out of date and do not offer critical guidance that relates to current and evolving risk sciences. It's also painfully apparent that the EPA risk assessors do not consistently follow all aspects of their existing guidelines. For example, the Science Committee's investigation into EPA's assessment of glyphosate found significant flaws in the scientific process of re-registering chemicals that warrants further examination. I believe that updated risk assessment guidelines should contain clear criteria for causal analysis so that there is little room as possible for subjective judgment that reflects the policy leanings of the analyst. The guidelines should identify, through careful evidence integration, the conclusions that have the strongest scientific support. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. White. Do you believe the EPA should update and revise its risk assessment guidelines? Do you believe that the development of updated risk assessment guidelines and adherence to these guidelines will inject more objective scientific rigor into EPA's chemical risk assessments, and will that make the development of risk assessments more transparent?
I thank you, Congressman, for that question. Transparent and consistent framework for evaluating chemicals is necessary. It needs to be transparent, and like I said, it needs to be consistent and science-based. As the science changes, risk evaluations need to be updated. So do the processes that are used. I mentioned 2016, Congress passed the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, which requires the EPA to make its decisions using the best available science and a weight of evidence process. What that means is a weight of evidence utilizes all the available science. It clearly identifies the criteria that it will use to identify the available data. It evaluates the quality of that data. And I think it's important to note when we talk about the quality of the data, just to go back to something Dr. Holt said about studies funded by industry and whether they should be discounted. I do not feel that a study should be discounted solely based on the funding authority. It should be reviewed and evaluated based on the merits of the actual scientific content in the study design and the value that that information will provide to the assessment. When EPA or any other agency evaluates the available scientific information, it needs to determine whether or not they have high quality information, looking across the board at all studies. One of the reasons that it's important to do a weight of evidence process is because it allows the agency to look across the board at all the available evidence to evaluate the quality of that evidence and then use that information to integrate and make decisions. This is information both on available human data, on the animal data that might be relevant to human exposures, and any mechanistic data that will tell us about how a chemical may be acting in the body.
Okay. And how would you suggest risk assessment guidelines account for uncertainties in the scientific evidence? When and how is it appropriate to use default assumptions?
So when scientific information is available, so when we actually have human data or animal data, that information should be used instead of a default. When we're looking specifically at uncertainties, sometimes in research we have animal data and we may not have available human information. So we need to have and be able to account for how that animal data is relevant or not relevant to the human exposure incident.
Okay, and then one last thing. Do you believe that exposure assessments should be included in revised risk assessments guidelines?
Exposure is a key piece of the risk assessment process. So not only do you need to look at the toxicity information, but also whether or not that toxicity is relevant to actual human exposures.
Okay. Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to add that?
Mr. Babin, if I may,
Yes.
well, first of all, in your first question, it may be true that the risk assessment guidelines need to be updated. But I just wanted to make sure that it didn't seem that I was implying that industrial research should be discounted on the face of it. Maybe Dr. White thought I said that. I certainly didn't mean that.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? With that, I will yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back 1 second. The chair now recognizes the
Interesting.
gentleman from the big 1st District of Kansas, Mr. Marshall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Dr. White. Dr. White, I represent the largest agriculture-producing congressional district in the country, and I'm so proud that the air we breathe there, the waters that my children and grandsons swim in are cleaner today than they were when I was growing up. As you can imagine, our farmers and ranchers utilize quite a range of tools, including herbicides and pesticides. And kind of a follow-up to Dr. Babin's thoughts or his question on glyphosate. I'm new here, so I was trying to understand, it was in a report, it was out of a report, but at the end of the day, it looked like the conclusion was glyphosate, Roundup, was not carcinogen. It's been around since 1960. And somehow that was taken out of the report, and I'm just trying to fill in a few loose ends. Why was it left out of the report or taken out of it?
So I can't speak to exactly why it was included or taken out of the report, but what I will tell you is this is why it's so important to have a consistent framework for how science evaluations are conducted, is that it's clear and transparent. You can see very clearly what processes EPA would have used to evaluate glyphosate, what science they use to make their conclusions, and it would be right there in front of you. So there would be no question about whether or not that data was accurate or valid.
Okay, thank you. My next question is for Dr. Belzer. I'm trying to understand these regulatory impact analysis. RIAs is another acronym for me. When they report RIAs to the OMB, is there any type of independent peer review before it's submitted?
I would say sometimes there is an internal peer review conducted by an agency, but generally that's not the case. There's basically OMB is performing the peer review. And one of the problems with that, from my perspective, is that OMB doesn't disclose the results of its peer review. It works for the president, and so its advice is proprietary to the president. I think that things would be a lot better if OMB actually disclosed its independent reviews of these documents, and I've advocated that since I worked there and told to mind my own business.
Do you think independent peer reviews would be of any help to maybe not every report, but a certain number of them randomly selected?
Certainly the larger ones ought to be. I think that the existence of an effective peer review process improves the quality of what agencies produce in analysis. I mean, just simply the knowledge that you're going to be peer reviewed goes a long way toward improving quality. Then, as Dr. White's pointing out, the panels, having a good peer review panel is very helpful. I'm the only person here who's actually a member of a Science Advisory Board panel. And I know the processes that, at least for my panel, how it goes on. It is a challenging enterprise with a panel of 15 members, for typically only 2 might be knowledgeable at a given issue that's actually on the table. So I think the peer review process does need to be restructured to make sure that there really are experts in individual areas, and that they don't, and that they have intellectual diversity. I don't care at all about who they work for, but intellectual diversity is the key toward teasing out the best scientific knowledge.
Okay, my last question is for Mr. Holmstead. You look bored there. No one's asked you a question. It has to do with WOTUS, Waters of the U.S. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Senator Bob Dole 6-7 months ago and had the conversation. He was one of the original co-authors of WOTUS, and of course I had to ask him, well, what does navigable stream mean to you? And what was your intention? And of course he said, well, you know, there's only 3 navigable streams in Kansas, and it's very obvious what we meant. And now there's concern that in my farmers that WOTUS is actually managing land. If you regulate water to such a great extent, it feels like you're regulating land, even though the agency said it doesn't want to regulate private property. So I guess my question is, how can the agency deny that by expanding vastly the definitions of WOTUS, that it effectively limiting the activities that it can occur on private property? I guess I'm trying to understand, WOTUS is expanded so much under the current interpretation that it's impacting private property.
You know, I don't think anybody at EPA could dispute that they're regulating private property. I mean, that's what it's all about. So even if you own your land, even if you own your land for 100 years, if somebody comes in and says there's a wetland on your land, you have to get a permit and you can be prevented from using that land. That's why there's been so much debate and discussion over what really is a wetland, and this most recent rule that's been referred to as WOTUS really does significantly expand the net, expand the jurisdiction, the amount of land that's covered by that process. And I think that's inappropriate, and I also think it's, well, I think it's probably illegal. But I also think this is an area where Congress could really step in and provide some guidance, because this is a debate that's gone on for many, many years now, with EPA making several stabs at trying to, define the type of land over which EPA and the Corps should have jurisdiction, and that's been difficult to do. But EPA has tried several times, and the courts have sent it back saying, no, you've gone too far. And I assume that this new EPA will make another stab at that and try to do something that's more reasonable and it's more understandable for people who really do care about what is a wetland.
Thank you for being so candid.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now turns to the ranking member for unanimous consent request.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to enter these letters, comments, and op-eds from the Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization, American Lung Association, the American Thoracic Association, and the National Environmental Health Association on their comments on EPA. The article, the Intercept article, Republicans are using big tobacco secret science playbook to gut the health rule, and then the introduction to the record of the 4 peer-reviewed studies in the record that collaborate the findings of the North study authored by Dr. Tom Carl and published by the Science magazine in 2015.
Seeing no objection, so ordered, the information will be added to the record.
Thank you.
As we conclude this hearing, I would like to take a moment and note, I think on behalf of myself and Chairman Smith, to my old colleague, Dr. Holt, Rush, on the issues involving Dr. Bates's concerns, I believe that it would be good for you to take the message back to the AAAS that they owe a fellow scientist making such claims the honor of withholding judgment until the matter is fully investigated. It's a very relevant and important issue. And with that, I thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional written comments and questions from the members. This hearing is adjourned.